Well, good afternoon. Welcome to All Angels Episcopal Church. It's great to see all of you out here today, and I am very excited about our presentation. Prior to our presentation, we need to remember that this is about war, and there are places of conflict and war in our world right now. So I'm going to ask you, in whatever tradition you have, to either bow your head, put your hands together. Let's take a moment of silence, and then I will lead us in prayer. Creator God, who calls us through love to restore all things, we wait with great anticipation, as your prophet Isaiah had said, that one day they will take their plowshares that have been beaten down from swords. Lord, that day is not today, and we pray for all of those who are in war-torn areas. We pray especially for refugees, for those in Ukraine, and you call us to pray for our enemies. So we pray for all who cause harm and who do not see the dignity of every human being. We ask that you bring your love and your grace and your protection and your spirit upon all flesh on this earth, and hasten the day that we will all celebrate in peace. We pray this in the name of our Creator, of our Redeemer, and of our Sustainer. Amen.
Amen.
So I'm thrilled to introduce to you our two presenters today, Chuck Palmieri and Liz Corson. So welcome. They're here to talk about today's program, Eyewitness to Dachau. Chuck is an active commercial real estate agent here in Sarasota. Did you bring some business cards with you? We might have some. And he's a member of the 42nd Infantry Rainbow Division. Chuck arrived at the Dachau concentration camp shortly after its liberation. Chuck describes his wartime experiences in his gold medal award-winning memoir, Boy Soldier, Recollections of World War II. Once our presentation is over, you will have a chance to meet Chuck and to purchase his book in our parish hall, and our Episcopal Church women, the ECW, has put out some coffee, tea, some refreshments, and a time for us to talk and to reflect, and also to get to know Chuck and Liz as well. I need to also mention to you that if there are things in this today that are coming up for you that you would like to talk about, tomorrow at 10 a.m. in our parish hall and online through Zoom, we will be having a discussion. We will talk about what Chuck has raised and what Liz has talked about in Dachau and where it has affected us. All are welcome. So at 10 o'clock in the parish hall tomorrow morning, or go to our website, click on the Zoom link, and you'll be brought in. And Liz, if you wanted to join us online, so you didn't have to drive across the bridge again, it would be wonderful to have you. So,
thank you.
Speaking of Liz, she grew up in Sarasota, and she attended Southside and Pineview schools. Any Southside Pineview School people here?
Probably not.
No. Anybody from Maine? Hey, we have some Mainers.
Okay.
Okay, good.
I'm from Brunswick, FYI. Brunswick. Okay, yeah. Okay.
And Elaine looks like she's from Brunswick.
No way. Okay, cool.
We are 2 degrees separated from one another. That's wonderful. So she remembers when Longboat Key was nothing but miles and miles of pine trees. Liz edited and published Chuck's memoir, an experience that has affected her deeply. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for those presenting Eyewitness to Dachau, Liz Corson and Chuck Palmieri.
Thank you very much, Father Marshall. Before we get started, I would like to thank Father Marshall for inviting us and letting us experience this beautiful campus of All Angels by the Sea. This is really lovely. And I attend Redeemer, but I'm glad now that I do attend Redeemer, because I'll tell you what, the drive out here from mainland is brutal. I could not believe it. And it was just from Redeemer to the bridge. It took almost 20 minutes. And I could see people just freaking out in their cars and their trucks. So I'm glad I worship in town and not here. But thank you, Father Marshall, for inviting us. I'd also like to thank the Episcopal Church women for hosting this, and they have planned a lovely reception following the program. So thank you all, ECW members. I'd also like to acknowledge one person here without whom this book could not have been written. And of course, I'm speaking about Chuck's wife, Carol Palmieri, who is sitting at the back. Carol, please wave to everyone. It takes a village to write a book. And I am confident that without the support of Chuck's family, and specifically Carol, we would not be here today. Chuck had these experiences, but like everyone else, he needed a little help to bring them to the public. We have a 3-part program planned for you all. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Dachau up to and including its liberation. And then we're going to hear from Chuck. What did he see? What did he think about what he saw? And how has this experience of seeing Dachau, how has this affected his life? And then we're going to have a third part, quite brief, but it's our hope that by this program, you all may be inspired to write your own life story. Because I think Chuck is going to agree that the process of writing and editing and then publishing this book has been wonderful. I hope he's going to agree. I didn't ask him that before I said that, but he's going to agree. And hopefully not only will you be motivated, but you will be inspired to sit down and take the time to be with just the quivering space between your ears and write down what life has been like for you. So let's get started. Dachau is 3 parts. This first part is the city of Dachau, which is located about 9.5 miles to the northwest of Munich. And as I mentioned, Dachau is 4 different things. So you have the city. And the city has been known for generations as a place, a mecca for painters, internationally known. And painters would flock to Dachau, and they would practice mostly what's called the plein air method. And here are some examples of Dachau art. Dachau art is a real thing. If the Dachau art can be properly authenticated, it commands a premium in the international art market. And you would see people painting in the bucolic scenes of Dachau and its environs. And the paintings are beautiful and very, very quiet if you look at them. But Dachau art is a thing. In 2009, in fact, Oglethorpe University hosted a large exhibition of Dachau art titled Dachau Before Dachau. Now, in 1933, Heinrich Himmler, who has been called the architect of the Holocaust, decided that the jail in Munich was too small. And Hitler, in his run-up to power, needed a place to incarcerate political prisoners. And so Himmler went out to a World War I era munitions factory outside of Dachau, about 1.5 miles, and he determined that that would be a dandy place to have what's called a concentration camp. Now, we always associate concentration camps with Jews, and no doubt Jews bore the brunt of Hitler's ire. But initially, Dachau was a prison, and people were sentenced, and they left after their sentence was served. But initially, the focus of Hitler, and this is 1933, so well before World War II, Hitler was incarcerating political enemies, and those included communists, gypsies, homosexuals, Jews, and all sorts of other people who protested Hitler. And one of the targets of Hitler's incarceration program were Catholic priests, because immediately they disagreed with Hitler's policy about euthanizing older people and infirm people. So feeble-minded people was one of the terms that were used back then, and Hitler wanted those people gone, erased from the earth. So Hitler originally planned to have Dachau house 5,000 people, and it almost immediately maxed out its capacity because there were so many enemies of Hitler. Now, in April 1945, the war was definitely winding down. The signs and symbols were there, and it was plain that the German army was on the run. The Allied forces were moving very rapidly toward Munich, and there were a number of different parts of the army that were moving. We had the 45th, 42nd, elements of the 3rd Army, and elements of the 20th Armored Division, all converging towards Dachau. And one of the things you have to realize, we talk about the fog of war. This was literally a place and time for the fog of war because things were happening so fast and so dramatically. Bridges were being blown up that had shown in maps. The maps were obsolete very quickly because the movement was so frantic and so quick towards Munich. So all these elements were converging towards Dachau, but most of the army did not recognize that there was a concentration camp in the way between the forces and Munich. So all these elements, not knowing about Dachau, were moving very rapidly towards Munich, so fast that they'd literally run out of maps. Now, I told you that Dachau is 4 different things. So we have the village of Dachau, which refers to the village of Dachau, but we also have the concentration camp. But the concentration camp had 2 parts of the whole camp. And here I'm going to show you this compound. So remember, the Allied forces were unaware that they were about to meet this large SS installation, which was part of this compound. It was not on any map. Huge SS installation, Waffen-SS. Most of the people who were in this installation were military officers being trained by the Nazis. And then, adjacent, contiguous to the SS compound, this is the actual concentration camp itself. And these were separated by a moat, the Worms River, which would eventually get into the Amper River. There was a 4 foot tall, 8 foot wide moat. And on one side, there was electrified barbed wire. If that wasn't enough, between the moat and the electrified barbed wire, there were guard towers, which were manned with guards with machine guns. So you could not escape from the situation once you were there. So there was the kitchen, there were all sorts of places. Oops, I do want to show one place, this yellow barracks. These are all barracks right here. But I want to focus on this barracks right here because this was known as the priests' barracks. And I mentioned earlier that one of the real firm protesters about Hitler's policy were Catholic priests. So they were housed in this one particular barracks, and they were brutalized in Dachau. The kinds of experiments that were done on these priests are so horrific that you can't even imagine. There were other medical experiments done as well. One of the things that the Nazis were very interested in is high altitude flying and safety for their airmen. And so they would experiment on the prisoners to see how high pressure affected the human body. And they were literally killing people right and left, experimenting on them, trying to get them, if you've ever had the bends, if you've ever gone scuba diving, this is the kind of thing that they were inflicting on these innocent inmates. So there were horrific things going on here, but there were also some things that sounded quite benign. For example, there was a china painting factory, which some inmates were involved in painting china. So you have china painting versus high altitude experiments, and it's kind of strange, that juxtaposition. But this is the compound. So we have the town of Dachau, we have the SS compound, we have the concentration camp itself. Now, on April 29th, 1945, elements of the U.S. Army were in the immediate vicinity of Dachau. And the 45th was to the north, the 42nd was in the middle of the 3rd Army. And because of their location, the 45th engaged the SS compound as they approached Dachau. They engaged the SS compound. Now, the SS, for some reason, did not recognize that the Americans were knocking at their gate, literally. So there was this big firefight in the SS compound. However, the 42nd, with better intelligence, rolled right up to the gate of the concentration camp. And there they were met by the acting commandant. Now, 2 days later, 2 days before then, almost all the guards had left because they knew the Americans were approaching, and they did not want to be caught at this concentration camp. So a contingent of Waffen-SS were brought in to basically hand over the camp to the Americans. There had been some discussion about killing all the inmates, but that was deemed impractical, and so the inmates lived. But the day before the liberation, 6,000 inmates were forcibly removed from the camp to be moved, because you have to remember, the Germans did not want the world to see what they had done. So there was huge movement of prisoners away from the advancing Allied forces. So you had the 42nd going right to the gate. And the person who did that was Brigadier General Henning Linden. He arrived at the gates of Dachau, where he accepted the official surrender of the camp from its acting commandant. It was horrific when they got there. I mentioned earlier that the camp had been originally built for 5,000 people. When the 42nd arrived, there were probably 32,000 people in the camp itself. Most of them were starving, in very bad shape. There had been a typhus epidemic because of improperly buried bodies. And so it was just absolutely horrific. And the other issue was that because the Germans had literally run out of fuel in the waning days of the war, bodies had stacked up. So not only were there thousands and thousands of emaciated, starving, terribly ill inmates, there were piles of dead bodies that had not been incinerated. So 32,000 living people and probably between 4,000 and 6,000 corpses above ground. These are some of the photos of the happy and very relieved prisoners, though I must say that according to most records, between 50 and 200 prisoners died every day for the next month because they were just too far gone to be saved. And I do want to point out, in this shot in the upper left, this is the moat. And you can see how deep it is when you look at the people who are inside the moat. There was a lot of violence when the camp was liberated. The inmates beat the guards, beat the dogs with their bare hands, and just almost killed everyone. Now, I will say also that men of the 45th, there's quite a bit of discussion about this, but men of the 45th evidently killed as many as 50 of the SS guards who had been guarding the inmates because they were so outraged at what they saw. And I'd like to read this because this is the official report by the U.S. 7th Army. And one of the things about this time is we kind of have lost track about our status in the world, the way people used to think about Americans. And I'd like to read this to you because it's very moving. Okay, Sunday, just after the noon meal, the air was unusually still. The big field outside the compound was deserted. Suddenly someone began running toward the gate at the other side of the field. Others followed. The word was shouted through the mass of gray, tired prisoners. Americans. That word repeated, yelled over the shoulders in throaty Polish, in Italian, in Russian, and Dutch, and in the familiar ring of French. The first internee was shot down as he rushed toward the gate by the guard. Yet they kept running and shouting through eager lips and unbelieving eyes. Americans. I can't even imagine what those people must have thought when they saw us coming through the gates. So Dachau is Dachau. Dachau is the SS compound. Dachau is the concentration camp. But Dachau was larger than just that concentration camp. Under the administration of the concentration camp, there were more than 100 subcamps. And in these subcamps, there were no frilly China painting sessions. No, the subcamps were usually located very close to either a farm or some kind of munitions effort for the Germans. There were almost 30,000 people in these subcamps when Dachau was liberated. And over the next several days after Dachau was liberated, these subcamps also were found, discovered, and liberated by Allied forces. Now, one of the things that both the 42nd and the 45th encountered as they approached the concentration camp is what's become known as the death train. So, as I mentioned, the Germans were very intent on making sure that the world did not know what had happened at these camps. And there was this large movement away from the advancing Allied forces. And so, about 3 weeks before the end of the war, 40 some odd railroad cars departed from Buchenwald, packed with prisoners. And there was no specific destination, no specific reason. The Germans just wanted them out of the way. So for the next 3 weeks, these railroad cars meandered through the German countryside, a little bit in Czechoslovakia, back into Germany, stopping only one time, when 900 people were forcibly detrained, massacred by the Nazis. The railroad cars they had been in were decoupled, and the rail continued until it arrived at Dachau. Now, when it arrived at Dachau 3 weeks later, believe it or not, there were people living alive in these boxcars. And to ensure that no one knew what had happened, the Dachau guards brought their machine guns to the trains and machine gunned down the trains to make sure that there was no one living inside those trains. But there was one man. There was one man. As Brigadier General Henning Linden's party approached the gates of Dachau, someone saw a pale hand reaching out from under the tangled corpses. This corporal yelled to his commanding officer. The commanding officer rushed over, leaped into the train car, and pulled out an emaciated young Polish man. And it's really a testimony to the human spirit when I tell you this story, because this young man had not had anything to eat or drink for 3 weeks. He was naked, and he was hungry, and he was thirsty, and you know he was scared. And when he looked up at his American liberator, what did he ask? Did he ask for clothing? Did he ask for food? Did he say, "I'm thirsty, I thirst"? No. What he said was, "Free. Am I free?" And the man looked down at him, Lieutenant Colonel, looked down at him and said, "Son, the Americans are here, and you are free." Now, interestingly enough, no one knows what happened to this young man, because Lieutenant Colonel loaded him up in a Jeep, and off they went to a local hospital. And they had an accident on the way. The Jeep overturned, and the Lieutenant Colonel and the young man were separated, never to see each other again. So no one really knows what happened to the young man, but one thing is for certain: he knows he was liberated by Americans. One of the things that's really important as an editor, as a publisher, is research. And one of the things that one of the things that you recognize early is that there are sources that seem reliable, but are not. And if you're really serious about publishing factual information, you really have to get to the nut of everything, the truth of everything. And as I began to read the accounts of the liberation, I remembered elements of the account sounding very familiar. And I thought, and I realized that I had read and am a big fan of Leon Uris's Armageddon. And there is an account of a liberation of a concentration camp in Leon Uris's Armageddon that's very similar to the account of the liberation at Dachau. So there was that book. And then I bought The Surrender of the Dachau Concentration Camp which was written by the son of the brigadier general who accepted the official surrender. This is the gold standard about the actual physical day of the liberation, because he's got minute-by-minute timelines, he's got amazing photographic evidence, he's got all the actors and players right there in black and white. It's a great book. But then you have something like The Liberator by Alex Kershaw that came out in 2012, and it is not factual, unfortunately. He promulgates some very debunked accounts of the liberation of the concentration camp. And then Dachau, 29 April 1945, is a compilation of the memoirs of members of the 42nd. So that's reliable. But that's one of the things that you can't just read something and assume that it's necessarily accurate, particularly something that happened a while ago. But we don't have to speculate about what it was like at Dachau, because we have someone who was there, who was at Dachau. And this is a great photo of a much younger Charles Palmieri. And Chuck, I wanted to start you off, and I was hoping you could tell our audience a little bit about your childhood and growing up. Were you a good kid, a bad kid? And tell us a little bit about your youth.
I was only a good kid.
Okay.
I'll tell you that I was born on April 23rd of 1926. And I remember that date because that's the same day that Queen Elizabeth was born. So she and I are relatives, I guess. Nonetheless, as a young man, first I wanted to make one comment on general. Some of you here have been servicemen. Some of you had sons or daughters that were service people, and you know that servicemen don't come home and talk about all the things that they did. Or they don't talk about the concentration camp. They don't talk about their Army days or their Navy days. They come home and just do what they're trained to do, and that is to raise a family and to go into business one way or another and do their work. So, and that's the case with me. When I was just a young boy, I spent the summers with my grandmother on a farm, and I worked a farm for her. And also, while I was in school, I played football, basketball, and I was not very good at any of them. But nonetheless, that's what I did when I was a youngster. And along the way, I was an altar boy at the Catholic Church, and I got to know a couple of priests and got to like them and appreciate what they were doing for the youth and for the families in the parish. And so I thought about it. I liked these guys, and I decided somewhere along the line that I would want to become a priest myself. And so I went to the little seminary in high school, and in my last year at the seminary, I decided I didn't want to be a priest. I like girls too much. It just wouldn't work in the Catholic Church. Nonetheless, we left I came home from my training camp in Arkansas and came home for a 2-week furlough, and the phone rang on the day we came back from church, Christmas Day, and they said, all soldiers, whether you have a furlough or not, you're to report immediately to a port of embarkation because we've lost so many soldiers in the Battle of the Bulge and other battles. We need you all up here right away. And so on the first day of January, I got on a ship called the Sea Tiger and went to France. When we arrived at France, and in no time, I was assigned to the 42nd Division and met the boys in the front who had been in the front lines. within 10 days, now remember, I'm 18 years old. I'm really not scared to death because I don't know anything yet. But we got to the front line in a foxhole. And while I was there, and you'll read this in my book, but it's a good way to start. I met the lieutenant who was in charge of our platoon. He had been a sergeant and just got a field officer's commission. And he said to me, Charlie, Palmieri, I'm sorry, we didn't call anybody by their first names. Everybody was called by their last name. Palmieri, he says, yeah, I want you to know that while you're in this front line today, I'm taking your partner with me to go on a patrol. And so you'll be alone in the foxhole. And he said, I don't like to do this to an 18-year-old with no experience, but there's nothing else I can do. And so I sat there that night, alone in a foxhole, listening to artillery shells, listening to shooting. Now I am scared to death. The morning finally came, and the clerk came down and said to me, did you have any activity here last night? I said, no, nothing. And then he told me that Lieutenant Maniello, the fellow I just met the day before, had been killed on his patrol. And when I saw him the day before, he had his little Italian-American dictionary. And he said, I'm going to give you this to keep until I come back from the patrol. He said, so I did. I kept it. Obviously, I couldn't give it back to him because he was gone. But I still have this Anthony Maniello's Italian-American, because he and I talked about after the war was over, we were going to go to Italy and visit there. Well, of course, that didn't happen. Not then, anyway. But
And you tried to find him.
yes, we tried to find him. Carol's been searching forever, you know, and of course, in the days that we first lost him, we didn't have the computer skills that we have today, which allows us to find anybody. Of course, we know he was buried, but we were trying to find his family. I'm still trying, nonetheless.
So what kinds of things did you do as a infantryman?
Well, we went from these foxholes that were very elaborate. They were dug deep and dug back into the side of the hill, and we actually had a room back there, so one guy could be sleeping while the other was watching. And of course, that first night, there was no sleeping on my part because I was alone. Nonetheless, while we were in those defensive positions, we went on patrols. Every week, we went on patrols into the enemy territory. Had little battles of one type or another. We lost more men. As a matter of fact, in the 100 days, the front days that I was in the front lines, we lost 50% of the men in our company. And I can tell you that I really do believe that I lived through this unscathed because I had my parents back at home. My grandmother was very religious, and all these people praying for them. And I really do believe that those prayers saved me.
Oh, yeah. So you were not at the liberation because you were liberating Munich.
Yes, we were on our way to Munich, and finally I have to tell you the story of Munich. But there was a man in our company, in our division, named Wolfgang Robineau. Wolfgang had been born in Germany, and when he was a young man, his father called, a young boy, his father called him and his brother in and said, listen, I don't like what's going on here in Germany, and one of your grandmothers is half Jewish, and I think that's a bad situation for us. So he said, I want you to go to New York and live with your uncle, which he did. He went to New York, lived with his uncle, eventually got conscripted into the United States Army. And because he spoke perfect German, he got into intelligence. And so when we came to the city of Munich was a beautiful big city. Nice churches, art galleries, different places, great restaurants, just wonderful, big, beautiful buildings. And Robinau got concerned because he had been in Munich as a boy. So he went to the commanding officer and said, you know, when we take a big city like this, normally what we do is blast it with artillery and just tear it apart. And I don't want to see that happen here in Munich, and I don't think you should either. So I would like to go into Munich on a Jeep and talk to the Bürgermeister. Bürgermeister is the mayor. So they said, okay, you can go. So they got a Jeep, and they drove right through German lines with white flags into the Bürgermeister's office. And he said to the Bürgermeister, we are ready to attack the city of Munich, and we will destroy it, just as Cologne and Würzburg and other cities were destroyed. Why don't you surrender this city to me, and I will call off all the shooting. So the Burgermeister had to go to the commanding general of the German forces. Unfortunately, he agreed, and they signed surrender papers. And Wolfgang Robinau drove back to our commanding general and gave him the surrender papers. The city of Munich was saved by one man, Wolfgang Robinau, who became a very good friend of mine and came down to visit us in Florida at one time, and is a very intelligent guy. Stayed in intelligence with the military forces for years, and eventually got into business and moved back to Munich. But I think the other thing I want to tell you about Robinau, he was the interrogator for the commanding general of Dachau. And he said to the German director, he said, how many people did you kill in the 5 years that you were in charge here? And this guy answered, can you tell me how many slices of bread you ate in 5 years? That was his attitude, his answer.
When you're a publisher, you get to choose what you publish. And a couple years ago, I declined to publish a gentleman in Venice's memoir. He was a German guy, and he gave me some interesting ideas, though, about what it was like to be in Munich before it was liberated. And he said repeatedly in his manuscript that it was the Allies' fault, the Allies' responsibility that the inmates in these concentration camps starved. Because he said everyone knew in 1941 that Germany had never been self-sufficient in food production. So when the Allies cordoned off Germany in 1941, it was inevitable that Germany would starve. And that made it inevitable that the low man on the totem pole, which was the concentration camp inmate, would starve. He also told some stories about starving in Munich as a boy. He told a story about trying to catch a pigeon to feed his family and climbing through a roof and then falling 3 stories down as he attempted unsuccessfully to catch this pigeon. He also shared with me that his grandfather had been in charge of the horses for the German army in World War I, and he had a kind of subsidiary role in World War II, which of course was largely mechanized, but they did have horses. And when a horse died, there were fights over every part of the horse's body because people were so hungry. But the thing that he said that really stayed with me was he said as a boy, every morning he could see trucks coming into Munich from Dachau filled with prisoners. And these prisoners were tasked with hand diffusing unexploded ordnance. And the story was that if you successfully hand diffused 3 bombs, you were freed. But apparently no one ever found out whether the Germans would be okay with freeing anybody because no one lived through 3 attempts to hand defuse bombs. But the business about starving inmates being the Allies' fault was a deal breaker for me, and I decided that I would respectfully decline to publish his memoir.
Can I say this?
Yes, of course.
This picture is myself with a sergeant in our platoon. Now, he got to Dachau before I did. And he came back and told me and told us all about the bodies piled up and about the bodies in the railroad cars. And frankly, I didn't believe him. I thought he was exaggerating. I just couldn't imagine that anybody could do that to other men. And so after I left him, I got on a Jeep with another man and we went to Dachau. And my first recognition of something wrong was the smell. It smelled so bad, you just couldn't believe it. So we went into camp, and the first thing we saw was the railroad cars, which were mentioned to you, with thousands of dead men in the railroad cars. And can you believe that in the event any of them were still alive, the Germans set up machine guns and fired into those 30 or so cars to kill anybody that might still be alive. The other thing that bothered me was, I don't mean to be crass about the fact that the bodies were people that are dead. That was terrible. But what was new that was terrible were the ones that were still alive. Over 800 died the first day after we liberated it, and more died from tuberculosis, other diseases, or just plain malnutrition. And they would come up to us and hug us, you know, and you know, they were smelled bad, but you felt sorry for them. I felt more sorry for those that were still alive because they were close to death.
So tell us about you. You walked around. How long were you there? What kinds of things did you see?
Well, the first thing we saw were the railroad cars with all the bodies. And then we got into the camp and saw the bodies piled 8 feet high. Men, women, and children, all naked, but obviously very dead. You just couldn't believe it. How can anybody do anything like that? And so we saw the furnaces where they burned the bodies, but they couldn't burn them anymore. They ran out of fuel, and that's why the bodies were just sitting there. And I can remember that scene of the bodies and piled up. It was horrible. I couldn't take it. And to seeing that and seeing the sick still alive, and I just couldn't take it anymore. And I threw up and went back to my Jeep. I couldn't stay any longer. And then I learned later that General Patton, Blood and Guts Patton, when he came to one of the concentration camps like Dachau, he threw up. And I said, if Blood and Guts could do it, I could also. But that was the end of my, of course I was there for probably half an hour and saw things I just, even now, I think about them and I can't believe that I saw that.
You know, one of the things that almost all reports of the towns that were associated with concentration camps, people, almost 100% said they didn't know that was going on there, that they were unaware that the ash, the smell, the workers. Do you buy that? Do you think that that's true? Do you think that could be true?
I don't see how that could be, because the smell alone would tell them something was wrong. But the guards did not have families in the city of Dachau. The city of Dachau was a beautiful little art gallery, art colony. And we went through that later in 1995. I went with the 50th anniversary of our participation in the Dachau, and while we were there, the Burgermeister told us the story that they were moving prisoners by truck and by car and walking through the city to get to the camp. And when they were doing this, the German soldiers were beating up on the prisoners, beating them, kicking them, and whatever. And the people in Dachau got upset about this. And they went to their Burgermeister and said, can't we do something about them treating these people a little more humanely? So the Burgermeister went to the commanding general of the SS and said, some of my people would like to meet you and talk to you about the way these prisoners are being treated. And the commanding general said, why don't you get a committee of about 5 guys, bring them here and we'll talk about it. So he brought them in, lined them up, and shot them all. And the bullet holes on the building are still there 50 years later, and we were told those bullet holes will be there forever. It's a reminder of what happened in Dachau.
And you yourself observed some prisoners and some guards come through Munich when you were stationed there.
Yes. I was stationed in Munich at the Volkssturm headquarters. It was on a main road, main Strasse, and as I was standing there, here comes a platoon size of 40 or 50 German soldiers, now our prisoners. And they come and they stop at this intersection. And I said to the MP that was in the front, the lead MP, and it was an MP back further as well, and behind them were 2 former prisoners, still in their pajama-like costumes. And I said, what's going on here? Who are these guys? He said, these are the German camp prisoner holders who smuggled food and medicine and blankets and sweaters to the prisoners. He said, these are the German soldiers that saved a lot of lives, risking their own lives. And I had never heard that story, and you'll never hear it anywhere else, because the only way I heard it is because the MP that was guarding these guys told the story. And the 2 prisoners in their pajama outfits were there to be sure that wherever they settled down, that they could tell the truth about these particular German soldiers.
Now, Chuck, I don't know if you can you read this? This is from your notes.
Yes.
Can you read this to us, please?
Yeah. We were not restricted in our walk through the camp, but the odor and the first view of the naked bodies of men, women, and children piled like firewood, 5 or 6 feet high, was so horrifying, so unbelievable, that I was not sure I could go further. I was physically sick, but determined to continue, if for no other reason, to justify my being a part of the Great War that had finally stopped this brutal murder of these innocent people. And I think to myself, and I thought then, that these hundreds of thousands of people that were killed, all of these prayed for their own freedom, and it didn't come in their lives. But their prayers were not wasted, because eventually the Americans, Canadians, and the Russians closed all these camps, and the people that were in these camps then were saved, and that's how their prayers were eventually answered.
So we're in a church, and you and I are both religious people, and I'm sure everyone here is interested in the question, how do we move forward and justify our belief in a loving God, having seen something like Dachau?
Well, like I said before, I couldn't believe that people could be so inhumane. And Churchill of England said that these camps showed the horrific lack of wait, I got it here. The Holocaust, this is Churchill speaking. The Holocaust was the greatest, more horrible crime against humanity ever committed in the history of the world. And that's the way I look at it as well. You know, I never thought about it. For weeks afterwards, I didn't sleep. I kept saying that this couldn't have happened, you know. I'm dreaming. Was this a bad dream or what? I really woke up at times saying that. But it did happen. And all I can say is that I was happy to be one of the people that stopped it, as all of our soldiers did. Thank you.
And that's something that you hear over and over in these accounts of the liberators, is that while they arrived too late to save the people who had already died, they were so happy to participate in the ending of the situation. So it was truly a mixed bag. And Chuck, you said you went back to Munich and you saw Dachau again. What was it like revisiting the camp when you went back in '95?
Well, when we went back in '95, all of the barracks were gone except one that was left there as an example. And they had a museum set up in a big hall. And while we were standing there, a young girl walked up next to us. The picture was of a German soldier leading a little child by the hand. And this girl standing next to us started to cry and weep. She said, mein Gott, mein Gott. She couldn't believe that they were doing this to little children. And neither could I, even now.
It's pretty obvious when you look at photos and old postcards of Dachau that physically Dachau, the village of Dachau, has not changed very much. 1913 looks very much like the 1970s, which looks very much like the 1990s. And the concentration camp, as Chuck mentioned, has been changed. The SS compound has been razed, but there is the concentration camp with only a barracks as a museum that remains. But there's no doubt in my mind, looking at these two photos of Chuck, you have Chuck as a replacement, Chuck post-Dachau, and this might have been taken during the time that you weren't sleeping very well. Chuck, this is such a sort of somber photo of you as a mess sergeant. Do you remember what you were thinking when that photo was taken? What were you thinking?
Well, after the war was over, I was first a platoon sergeant, and I went on a little furlough to the Riviera, I have to tell you that. And stayed in an absolutely magnificent suite with a fellow soldier from Kansas. And you have to remember now, I'm a young boy who lived in a flat on the second floor in a little house in Buffalo, and my friend was from Kansas City, from Kansas, and he was a real farmer. We had never seen anything like the opulence in this great room that we were in. So he walked one way and I walked the other, and finally he yelled, "Palmieri, come in here. What's this?" And I went in. I didn't know what it was. I said, "Well, maybe it's to wash your hair." It was a bidet. But I didn't know what a bidet was for 5 years after that.
One of the things that's interesting, I've got a library now of about 500 Dachau World War II related items because I've begun to get very interested in it and collect memorabilia. And of course, eBay is the place you go where you collect. And from time to time, little bits of Dachau and the 42nd Infantry history will appear. And this was fairly recently. This is from the estate of Max William Hessman, who was a corporal in the 42nd's Quartermaster Company. And these were some things evidently that were in Mr. Hessman's possession when he died. And it's really kind of sad, you know, when you see these important family artifacts just come up into the anonymous forum of eBay. So please, if you have anything like this at home, don't turn to eBay. And this I could not afford. Believe it or not, there's a lot of money involved here. And I think this particular lot went for about $600, even with the moth-eaten 42 patch. But there are places where I think it's more appropriate for this kind of material. There are museums all over the country that focus on World War II. So please consider again before these things, family things, pop up on eBay. Well, Chuck's book originally was published, and one of the most exciting moments of my life was when I got the call that it had won, not the bronze, not the silver, but the gold medal in the Florida Authors and Publishers hotly contested memoir and autobiography category. And I was so excited I had to pull over and I cried for about at least 5 minutes because I was so thrilled. Now, Chuck, you've now are an award-winning author with your first book out of the gate. You won a gold medal. Have you enjoyed the process of writing the memoir? Did you think it was worthwhile?
I enjoyed it, but I'm not going to do another one.
I'm trying to convince Chuck to maybe write a little bit more about his childhood. But would you think the process was worthwhile?
Oh, it was marvelous. If it weren't for Carol typing up my notes, and I have to tell you, we almost divorced 4 times. She was doing my writing, and then to have this expert put the thing together so that it's readable and a prize winner. But I thank you very much for what you did.
Well, thank you.
I just want to say one other thing. There was more to my time in the service than Dachau. Some big cities that we took, Würzburg, Schweinfurt, we did a lot of fighting in those cities. And I just feel that one of the cities I ended up is Salzburg. And we had a camp in Salzburg called Marcus W. Orr. And I was in charge of the platoon that was guarding the camp. And we had prisoners who were members of other countries of Europe who had decided to side with the Nazis, with Hitler. And they were arrested and then interrogated. And what was I saying about?
So you were 18?
Yeah, I was 18 years old, and the commanding officer called me into his office and says, "I have to go to Washington right away." He said, I would like you to take over this camp. And here I am at that time, 19 years old, in charge of a camp of 3,000 or 4,000 prisoners. And I got thinking about the camp at Dachau, and of course our camp was nothing like that. In fact, our prisoners didn't want to escape because we fed them very well, and the people in Salzburg were starving. So that was a big job for me, and one I really didn't appreciate it. And I just want to mention the other thing is that when I went to the Riviera in August, we heard about a bomb called the atom bomb was dropped in Japan, and then a second one. And then the war was over. So here we were training to go to fight in Japan, and now the war is over. What a relief for us. And there's one more thing I do want to mention. I met the pastor of a large church, and he was arrested by Hitler and house arrest at first because he was outspoken about the atrocities that he knew about, outspoken about the fact that they were killing children, killing Jews. And this bishop came back while we were there, and we met him. And I thought it was a great thrill to meet a man who was so much hated by Hitler that he wanted him killed. But Hitler's associates told him, "You can't kill him because he's so well liked in Bavaria and you'll blow everything up. So we have to leave him alone." So they arrested him. But we met this man, and you read about him in my book. And if you get a chance to read a book, I want you to pay particular attention to a chapter called Spaghetti and Meatballs. You can read that, and that's it.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience? Because I don't know about you all, but when someone who's 95, almost 96 speaks, I'm all ears. So do you have any last thoughts?
As individuals, about the only thing we can do is vote. Vote for the kind of people that we think will not allow these things to happen again. And of course, and also pray. I really believe that prayer saved my life. And